6 or 7, I started playing baritone ukulele, and Jonathan Glasier was my first teacher. He taught at La Jolla Music, and my mom would take me down there every week, and I'd get a lesson with John, and he taught me some simple classical guitar and also some folk. I remember some song called Lemon Tree, some different like simple little folk songs, probably some easy Beatles songs, but he was really the reason. My mom was super supportive, but she wasn't like that. She played classical guitar and I think also took some lessons with John, but I felt like he was really the reason I kept going with my music. And I had no idea of all his talents as far as the microtonal instruments that he created and that whole side of him. If it hadn't been for him, I probably wouldn't have kept going on music. I mean, it definitely inspired me. And he was just, this kind of long hair. He's like he is now. I mean, he was like this kind of long hair hippie guy, just like, I really looked up to him. I thought it was the coolest thing because my mom wouldn't let me grow my hair long, and I was like, oh man, I want to be like John Glasier when I grow up.
Man, he's the cockeyed optimist, I tell you. He is forever optimistic and hopeful and thinking what possible things we could do. But and then he always taught music, guitar, and all of this, and so he saw also the educational thing about this, and what is obvious that this is a really good aspect of it. That we had a pamphlet. We put a little pamphlet together. Yeah.
Do you have memories of him approaching strangers and trying to get out his pamphlet about free improv in the park in the 70s?
He probably did that. I was probably down over here playing. John, go on and do the marketing. No, he was very big about that aspect and getting us gigs and getting us workshops, and he did. He really wanted it out there.
I grew up playing guitar, and in fact, my first job was as a guitar teacher at La Jolla Music, and 1965 when I was 20 years old. And my dad taught there and said, hey, you want a job? There's an opening as a... So, teaching music has always been a very interesting aspect to me. And by that time I was already improvising. I got into improvising through the guitar, first with flamenco, and then with East Indian guitar with Ravi Shankar. And so I ended up discovering this really cool tuning. It's the first time I started messing around with tunings, called Dadgad, which is D-A-D-G-A-D. And I went to my dad and I said, Dad, I want a sitar. He says, well, you can't afford a sitar. Why don't you tune your guitar like similar to a sitar? And I said, Dadgad. And that's what it turned out to be.
Not only must this magazine continue, but funding for research and development of new scales and instruments, the setting up of centers, the coordinating of symposia, the exchanging of ideas, and hopefully the availability of scholarships. Why was it such a important thing to give back to the community in this way?
Actually, a lot of it revolved around first Harry Parch, and I'll go back to my story of teaching the guitar, and I thought, well, I was John Denver, Bob Dylan, all of those people were right in Paul Simon. They were in my bailiwick, and the Eagles and all of those groups. And I thought, well, gee, I know most of this stuff, and do I want to go in that direction? But then all this whole Harry Parch world, and I said, this is really, there's more meat here. That would be about me, but this is about something bigger than me. And so I made a conscious determination not to become a rock and roll star or a folky or whatever I would have been, country rock, whatever. And it helped, really, what helped is that in 1967, Harry Partch was given a Regents professorship at UCSD. And so he needed an assistant. And there I was, willing and able to be his assistant. And because I'd already been his assistant before that even happened. And so I was at San Diego State. But to tell you the truth, I wasn't really interested in the music department because I was interested in this other stuff. And there was no, other than Danley Mitchell, whom was really Partch's main man, who was at San Diego State for many, many years as a percussionist, long retired. But there was a real problem, and that's one reason Partch didn't last too long at UCSD, because he really wanted Mitchell to come and be his collaborator, because Mitchell put on the Partch works and everything. I didn't, I was just a young squirt, but I was just at the foot of the master basically, even though he was a taskmaster, really hard to deal with. But I learned a lot about
specific characteristics of his assistant. Could you comment on that?
Well, he said he needed somebody to drive him around to different places and find the right piece of plastic or the right little rubber grommet or the right piece of bamboo. And I thought that was just fantastic. So I was his gopher, basically, as well as something that was the most incredible musical experiences. One of the most incredible music experiences of my life was tuning his chromelodeon. Now, the chromelodeon is basically a reed organ, and it's the same concept as a accordion. They have these metal brass reeds, and you pump them, and what if they're, so you have to change the pitch on them because they don't come in microtonal sets. So you put your little knife under and you either file a little bit off the bottom of the reed to make it lower, or file a little off the top of the reed to make it higher. And it took me like probably at least a month to do that, but it allowed me to really get into the realms of ether of tuning and counting the beats and being able to hear like an 11. So, and that 11 is something that you can't hear. Most 12-tone musicians can't hear because it's right between the two notes. In fact, if you play 24 equal, which gives you the quarter tone, then that hits the 11 right on the button. So it's exactly as far off as it can be to 12. Anyway, that was, that gave me a real lifelong ability to understand how to tune. And then, so when he became the professor at UCSD, I tuned 472 strings before each rehearsal and concert. And so that was because his strings, his instruments were mostly plucked string and idiophone, basically, which is, like a bar, something that you hit is mostly an idiophone. So easy to tune. Strings are easy to tune. So that's he was a victim of not having a Peterson tuner around to be able to. So he had to do it all by ear, and I learned that, and that was really amazing.
You know, a lot of people can read biographical information about Harry Parks, but he was like an uncle to you.
Yeah.
What was that relationship like? How did not just as a musician, not just as your ear development, how did he impact you as a person, as a man?
Parch was a real hard, a maverick, and he wasn't a good buddy type of person. He was kind of a tortured soul. But he was also, a visionary. And the reason he was a tortured soul is because he wanted so much for his vision to manifest, but it was such a large vision based on so many parameters that were really hard to, you can imagine a guy who's a hobo from the years in the 40s, and then he's making all these instruments, and there's all this cartoon of him hauling this barge with his instruments, with his knapsack on the other shoulder, and it just doesn't really. But the hobo days gave him, the wayward and some really wonderful elements to his work. But he had that damned if you do and damned if you don't kind of thing that wasn't really my personality. So, but I wasn't around Parch in order to be his buddy. I was there to learn and to be of service.
What do you mean by a 12-tone rut as a stumbling block? What does that mean to you?
Well, it just means that you it's almost like in your DNA, because those are the notes that you know, and you don't have a language for those other notes. So how can you have a positive attitude about those things that you don't know, because they're alien to you? And and you play this note and this sounds alien and it doesn't sound right, but then you start to include it, and then you change a little bit. So I was interested in the evolution of people opening their ears and not being in the 12-tone rut.
How did you guys integrate so much analysis into this?
Well, a concatenation is basically meaning one right after the other. It's referring to a chain, and of what do you have a concatenation of large spaces or small spaces? And the other word, corporeality is that's sort of the Parch buzzword. And that means basically the integration of the arts and everything being important. And the idea of, he hated the idea that in opera the instruments were relegated to the pit. That was, he says, your instruments, put them on stage. Let them live as part of the activity. And so he made beautiful sculptural instruments that looked great on stage.
foundation. Could you talk about the business model? Were you the founder? Were you the CEO? Could you talk
Founder and basically CEO too. I didn't have a whole lot of help, but my wife's ex-husband was a lawyer, and you have to get your articles. You got all that stuff together, your articles and your goals and your so I was able to get that together, and I had already started to. I received a grant by being under the umbrella of another nonprofit, because you need something like a couple of years of activity in order to people to know what your motives are, basically. And so I was able to get it done just in a fairly short period of time. And and there was actually an important person who was my main donor, was Parch's main donor in the latter part of his life. Her name was Betty Freeman. And she also helped with mostly the printing costs of Interval. It wasn't like money in my pocket or anything, but it was money that wasn't out of my pocket too. We had several events. The first place that we had was in the Knights of Pythias building, which is where Horton Plaza is right now. It was one of the famous artists in San Diego. His name's Mario Torrero, and he painted the eyes of Picasso on this building, which is on the pink Terry Riley interval. On the back of that is the eyes of Picasso. That's the building that we were in the early 80s. I was also working with this is early Interval years. I was working with a dancer, Judith Essex. She is on the cover of the blue, the issue that came out right after that. Going like this. So we were working together, and every Friday we had a thing called Dance Jam. It went on for years even after I left, because people really felt the home in Dance Jam. So that was another thing that evolved out of Interval, which I'm very proud of, basically, because it's in that corporeality aspect of it. And then during the early years, we would improvise music while the people were dancing around, and it wasn't all just drop the needle. Those were great years, the early Interval years, because we'd have concerts all the time, and I have lots of flyers and stuff like that still. I don't know why I kept them, but of all of those, years. In fact, for about a year, 1981, we had a calendar published every month of all the stuff we did. It was so much.
This was not your average music. It was not a necessarily 12-tone thing that people were dancing.
No, I'd bring my weird instruments and just jam, and people just want some music to. And it wasn't all drums either. It was just kind of an interesting, exotic atmosphere.
One of the things that you said was there was beautiful music available to those who are willing to explore.
Being an improviser myself, I wanted more tools in my tool chest, more of a palette of colors to choose from rather than the 12-tone palette. And so because I like to improvise, I wanted more tools. It wasn't like I discovered microtonality. I already knew it through Parch. But one thing about Parch, it was very interesting. There's a whole Parch movement. And they're all just intonation people, and which is the notes of the scale corresponding to the harmonic series like he did. But he always made it very clear to me, don't follow me. Make your own trail. And so the book that I'm writing is called Along the Microtonal Trail.
What is something that really does separate you?
I don't play in just intonation most of the time. And then, of course, Bart Hopkin, bless his soul, said he's going in a different direction. He just sees so many instruments evolving, his experimental musical instrument. You know, the combination of all of this stuff happening, I feel really great to have been a part of it and a bit of a spearhead in all of this kind of activity happening during the late 80s. And
Talk about what your definition of improvisation means.
it's very elastic. That goes back to the id Project days, which was mid-70s, around 75 through 77, with Tom Nunn. And he was, in fact, he wrote the book, as far as I'm concerned, on improvisation, The Wisdom of Impulse.
When the summer came, I put out a word that we would, I wanted to start a group, and I put a notice on a bulletin board or something like that. Somehow Jonathan found out about it, and then he contacted me, and then the two of us started putting out notices, and we ended up with the id Project, which, you know, had people who had never played music in their lives, you know, or a dancer or somebody else. And this was all worked out to me fine, because it wasn't just finding out what a musician can do with these things, but find out what regular people do with these things, you know.
We were interested in the philosophy of improvisation, and we got into the identity. You create an identity, whatever that is. It doesn't have to be a scale, or, you know, it could be, here's a flower. How would you express that flower? Now let's use that expression as an identity for creating a piece that, with these instruments, that might go in this direction or that. There are roles that you play in improvisation, and the main thing, there's the lead role and support.
My initial idea was to seek the very essence of what music making is. So get rid of all idioms, get rid of all familiarity, and then let come out what music is there because of influences, whatever they are, whoever they are, but just let them come out. And it became very liberating to me, because for one thing, I could start to make music that was more interesting than what I could write. Me. Not anybody, but I mean, what I could write. I think it was a combination, for me, a combination of the freedom that Cage brought to process. And even though he didn't like improv, but he brought this freedom. And then the instruments of Harry Partch opened up that gate for a whole different reason than what I wanted to do. I think a lot of musics work hard to lay out their territory, their definition, their identity, right? And they hang on to that for dear life, I think. And this music has an opposite approach about that. This music, you don't go into this necessarily looking for an identity about something. If you do, you're here for the wrong reasons. You know, you're gonna get wrapped up in a little corner and paint yourself there. But if you have an open mind to things, you know, you're not defensive about what you've done, no matter how good it might be, you know.
But did you come from a musical legacy, a family of music?
Well, my father was musical. My mother actually was musical until, I think she played the violin in high school, I think, and then but then when she met my father, she I mean, he was a composer, and my father was a professor of music at Arkansas, University of Arkansas. And so that's where I was born, in Arkansas, when he was the professor there. And my mom was a poet, so I came from an artistic family. and of course, my father's brother, Uncle Marshall, was a fairly famous painter. He was the way that Parch became connected with our family, is that when Parch was doing his book in Wisconsin, and he met my Uncle Marshall there, and then my Uncle Marshall said, "You got to meet this amazing musical guy." So that's how my father met Parch, but it was through our family. To be able to improvise with your father is just, I can't even tell you, it almost makes me cry to think of, the experience that we had as a father and son when you're creating music together on a dynamic level, and you've done this beautiful improvisation, and all of a sudden the last four notes are exactly in unison. You know.
How did you guys get connected with people in New York and San Francisco and just all around the States, man?
Through the magazine. I started sending magazines out, and I sent them out to colleges. And in fact, by the time I was finished with my, 19 issues, I had 200 colleges and universities as subscribers. They were half my subscribers.
Number 1200 came up quite a bit.
Yeah, and basically the number 1200 is how we measure pitches. And we, in the octave, there are basically frequencies. And let's start, if you start at A440, then the octave will be A880. Well, that doesn't relate to me, because that's not 8 of something, that's 2 of something. So that's 1-1 is 440 and 2-1 is 880. So an octave is a 2-1. And that's the physics of what an octave is. It's not 8 of something, it's double. So the way we measure that, though, in 12-tone terminology, is every semitone, all 12 of them, get 100 cents. So an octave of semitones would be 1,200 cents. And so if whatever you're measuring, if it's 467 cents, then that's what that chart really is talking about. Was that measures up. You can see that they just along the bottom is the just intonation, and that's the physics thing that I was doing, and that shows you the small number ratio that is the physics part of it, and then all of the 12 equal will have 100, 200, 300. 19 will have every 86 cents will be a note, and so on. But that kind of gives you an idea. The 1200 is 1,200 cents and 1 octave, and that's the measuring tool that we use.
Your father was a violist and a violinist in the San Jose Symphony?
Mm-hmm.
What did having that exposure, growing up,
I was never really drawn to play a lot of classical music, but I still do. I might still play some classical on my guitar and everything. My parents took me to see Segovia when I was like 10 years old, and that's what made me want to play the guitar, because he had these massive meat hooks of a hand, and if you looked at his hand, you'd say, well, this guy's not a musician, but they were just gifted. I feel very blessed that I did have all of this, and I also feel that I had enough gumption to say, well, this is a blessing, let's use it somehow.
Could you talk a little about why it's so important that, just that anyone can play, anyone can participate?
I think we have to talk about UCSD and the Music One project. And so they had a project there. Of course, I was already into improvisation. I was already into flamenco and Ravi Shankar, but they had a very much ground up music, introductory to music program, which was, along my philosophy as you don't learn to read and write before you learn to speak. And so it was an experiential music, introduction to music. That really affected me, and I really got it, that anybody can be a musician if you're speaking, then you're using all of the elements of music. Dynamics, pitch, articulation, all of that stuff is happening all the time as you're speaking. So why is that any different than speaking in music? It's not. It's the same thing. But we have this veil of, I'm a musician, you're a musician, I'm not. What? And that just seemed ultimately so dumb and so stupid that, so why not lift the veil? We could be much better, much more musical people if we would just, and other cultures don't have that problem. You're part of the ceremony from day one, whatever. You're just integrated into it, and if you don't, that might not be your thing, but if it is your thing, then you will automatically develop. And okay, Ivor grew up in Portland, Oregon, and his family was a sort of a highbrow Catholic family, and his father was the editor of the weekly Catholic newspaper. His uncle was the Bishop of Kansas City. And Ivor grew up as an absolute genius musician. And, but he was always, from the day one, the exact opposite of my integration with my father. He ended up leaving his father when he was 17, and his mother came with him. He said, I can't take this anymore, because they wanted him to be a monk. Well, irony of all ironies, he ended up sort of being a musical monk. But his father did not want him to go into music. His father wanted him to go into religion because he was so brilliant, and he would be, the star of the family and all of this stuff, and, expectations, what that gets you. And so he left his family, and his name was Gerard O'Hara. And so he retrograde inversioned his name to, he gave himself Ivor because that means man with a bow, and he played the cello. Ivor. That probably means this kind of bow, but anyway. And then Darreg is the retrograde inversion of Gerard. And he was a composer, and at an early age. In fact, he and his mother moved to San Diego in like 1937, and I will show you later. He built one of the very first synthesizers on the planet, this electric keyboard oboe, which is in the other room. It's not working, unfortunately. But just, amazing stuff. And then about 1940, he electrified his cello, which I don't know if it had been done by that time. And in 41, he built the electric keyboard drum, which is a bunch of relays. Remember they used to have the telephone thing? But if you feed them too much electricity, they buzz. So he had all of these relays there, and with a keyboard, and they go, the first electric keyboard drum. He struggled his whole life until basically, financially, because he couldn't really have a job. And but my wife and I brought him down here and actually bought him a house for the last few years of his life. He could live in peace. And he did more during those last 8 years.
That's one thing about Jonathan. He takes care of people. He's a really amazing dude. So he really liked what Ivor was doing. And Ivor was a pioneer in the intonation systems like Parch was. But Ivor was this eccentric old guy that, in the 40s, he invented an electric oboe or something like that, I believe. And he was unique. We would go down to visit him, and he'd open the door and just about grab you and pull you into the room and say, look at this, look at this. He was that dynamic.
He says, tuning to 12 tones per octave is the simplest and cheapest way because it would cost too much to make organs or pianos in another scale.
Well, that's true. It's an economical way of getting the smallest amount of pitches relatively in tune. But then after you've done it for 250 years, maybe you want to explore something else. The reason that it all came together into one scale was sort of like, I'll give you the analogy of, on this side you have the horse and buggy, and this side you have an automobile. Everybody had to know how to fix a cotter pin on his wheel on his horse and buggy. You didn't send your horse and buggy to a mechanic. You fixed it yourself because it was fairly simple. Well, on the musical side, you had a harpsichord. Well, you had to know how to tune your harpsichord because they don't stay in tune that well. And so you had to have that extra thing that you don't have, just like any leap in technology. You lose something and you gain something. And what you lose is that perception of tuning because you call a piano tuner in to tune your piano, because it's too hard to, it's the automobile part of it that, you need a mechanic. And now you need a computer expert to fix your car. And, these guys, Ivor was another visionary like Parch. And it's handy to have those people around because they do show you the way. And, luckily my wife and I were, had enough on the ball to bring him down from Glendale, which his house was sold out from under him. He didn't really had no place to go. So, we feel really good about that. saved him basically. I like the way your sparkling earrings lay against your skin so brown. I wanna sleep with you in the desert tonight, with a billion stars all around. 'Cause I got a peaceful, easy feeling, and I know you won't let me down. 'Cause I'm already standing on the ground. Like I found out a long time ago, what a woman can do to your soul. How but she can take you anyway. You don't already know how to go. 'Cause I got a peaceful, easy feeling.
How have you adjusted during COVID? How have you adjusted during quarantine?
Pretty well. We just had our second shots, and you know, in our age group now, we're just scheduled our first party because we're all doubly shot with our baby's love, you know. This room here used to be in South Park, and I've just lucked out. The thing is, I had a partner who's still there at 2961 Beach Street, and he just was so hard to get along with. And so on December 2019, I closed it out, and right before the pandemic and everything, so I sort of left him holding the bag, which is fine. And then once I got everything here, I thought, well, I'll open up a couple days a week down here, but all the music just kind of keeps drawing me, because there's so much. I mean, I'm an unfinished person. And as far as COVID, I'm really glad to be able to come down here every day. You know, I get out of my wife's hair and you know, really enjoy what I'm doing. So I've finally bought an electric car. So I'm not, you know, putting $50 worth of gas in the environment anymore, because I said, well, I do drive a lot, but I'll make the decision to go electric then, so I'm not fouling the air. So I feel really good about that.
Following the ways of Bob Dylan right there, like going electric.
Yeah, a little bit different, but yeah, right.
Wow, what kind of car did you get?
Got a Leaf.
Oh, nice.
Oh, nice. People like performing musicians were struggling. Do you have any advice for those
inspired?
guys? Yeah, just stay inspired, stay moving.
You know, each person has to really think of, maybe I have other tools in my bag, because music is not going to fill the coffers. It's not going to, you know, fill the gas tank or fill my belly. So just realize that it's always there. And I think musicians do fear that, well, if I let it go, then it's gone forever. It's not, you know. Just have faith that it will be back to semi-normal, and but be elastic. You know, be able to go in a different direction if you have to, and know who your friends are and stay in touch. And that was the little flyer from the IT project that we had. We went up in Balboa Park, took all of our little instruments and hung them in the trees and everything, and then one by one we would we would step out and hand our mallets to like just somebody coming by. And then after a while, there was this whole group of people that none of them were us. We're all playing music because they, in their mind, they said, well, there's somebody keeping this together. And here all of a sudden they're playing this beautiful improvised music. And just, we tricked them into it. Tricking people into their own creativity. I love it.